Hi, my name is James Andriella, and you are listening to the Back to Human podcast. If you follow me on social media, you've probably seen that I mentioned that I mouth tape every single night before I go to sleep, along with the dangers that come about from mouth breathing. This is a really effective and cheap tool for me to get better quality sleep and ensure that I am nasal breathing throughout the night. And I honestly believe that mouth breathing may be one of the single worst things that you can do for your health, whether you know it or not. There are plenty of books that you can pick up regarding this that I will leave in the show notes. One that I like in particular is Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Life by George Catlin. And it's a pretty short read, and it even has some like over dramatized sketches in there that depict just how unattractive mouth breathing can be. But beyond vanity, mouth breathing can have some serious negative consequences for your health. On today's show, we are going to be talking about your plumbing, your respiratory plumbing, that is. So we'll be talking about how some features of your anatomy may be impeding you from breathing effectively, and some strategies and procedures that may be able to help you along your journey. On the show with me today, I have Greg McLean. Greg has been a trainer for the past 25 years, and he is the co-founder of Premier Fitness Systems located in Scottsdale, Arizona. I stumbled across Greg's Instagram page, Project Airway, one day while I was browsing, and I really liked the content that he was putting out because while I'd say that we're pretty aligned when it comes to just how harmful mouth breathing is, he was addressing things that I wasn't even aware of, such as tongue ties, lip ties, palate expansion. I didn't even know that was available. So we'll be expanding on that in this chat, and there may be a bit more to better breathing than just throwing a strip of tape on and calling it a night. So I'm really excited to get into this episode, and without further ado, Greg, welcome to the show, brother.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me today.
Pleasure to have you, brother. So would you mind giving my audience a little bit of a brief background of your journey? Because I know there is a whole lot that you've been through. You've done it pretty much all at this point.
Yeah, I've been in the fitness world for 25 years. We've had our gym, Premier Fitness System, for 14 years. So I think for me, like, it all started with just like a passion for health, fitness, understanding the body. I've always been, I went to school for 3 years for electrical engineering. So like I've always had like a science passion, but it was kind of one of those things where like I can't sit at a desk for the rest of my life. So I was like, I got to do something else. Thought I was going to possibly do firefighting, and then kind of interesting, my buddy in the fire academy, when I started training part-time, graduated with exercise science, thought I was going to go into firefighting. And then interesting that like one of the guys in my fire academy, actually his roommate was my business partner right now, who I got his first job. So we went out to the bars one night. This is a long ass time ago. And he had like a few months left at ASU, exercise science. I was already working part-time training while I went to school for fire science. And then basically there was a new gym that opened up in Gilbert, Arizona. And I ended up like getting him his first job. And then it was something where at our gym, there was 6 guys, or actually there were 7 of us. 5 of the 7 of us opened gyms, but it was like a bunch of 20-year-old dudes that like loved to work out, best friends. All of our clients became friends at a 24-hour fitness, and just like loved coming to work every day. Like all my good friends, a lot of my clients I really enjoyed working with. And it was like, I was like, you know what? Like, I think I'm going to stick with fitness. And so it's something where, fast forward to basically 14 years ago, and I had worked at 24-hour fitness. I worked at Lifetime, and then me and my business partner are like, you know what? Like, let's leave corporate. Let's do our own thing. I think there's a lot of things we can do better. There's a lot of things we can leave behind that I don't really love about corporate. And so we kind of went that route. And right around that time is when I feel like I was at like the prime of my life. Had a girlfriend, I was doing real estate on the side, made a bunch of side money. We basically had just opened the Lifetime Fitness in North Scottsdale, which was their top club in the country. And it was like all these great things were supposed to be happening. And I just all of a sudden, for the first time, felt in my life that like there was something that was just like off. And it was like, I remember it was like 2007, I ended up going and getting MRI on my brain. And it was like, I just started experiencing like brain fog and fatigue. And it's like, looking back, I think this is kind of something similar happened. One of my really good buddies who's 28. It was like, here I was, it was like girlfriend. I would party on the weekends. I think I sold 14 houses that year, full-time trainer. I had a client that I was training 3 days a week outside the gym. I worked out every day. And then it's just like looking back, it's like, all right, I was basically trying to sustain this impossible task from a work perspective that I felt like, as someone that was type A, like that was just what I did. And I think for the first time in my life, I hit this wall of like, I can't sustain this. And I'm in this place of making really good money. I've got this great situation from my family, money, job love, but it was like, I'm not happy. And it's like, I don't know what the hell is wrong with me. And that was kind of like the first indication that like there's something off. So of course, I'm 30, I go see this doctor and he's like, oh, you're perfectly fine. Your MRI is clean. And so it's kind of something where, just kind of go on with life, kind of changed a little at work, but for the most part, my life stayed the same. And then it was like, fast forward to like 2 years later, and it's like, we're a few months before we opened our gym, and it's like, I got my first autoimmune disease. So I had celiacs. And, that was an eye-opening experience. But one of the coolest things was like, I had a 40-year-old client that had it for 10 years. And like, it was kind of something where it just like all of a sudden shows up in your life and you just get like really sick. And I remember that was back when it was like, I thought I had the H1N1. My doctor's like, yeah, that's what you got. And I was like, okay. I went down for a week, felt like horrible flu-like symptoms, was fine the next week. And then it was like, I was fine for like 3 months. And then all of a sudden it was like, bam, it hit again. And go back to the doctor and he's like, oh, I think you got it again. So it was like down for another week. Kind of one of those things where it's like, I was back to work the following week. And then it was like the next week it happened again. And it was like, all right, dude, there's something wrong. And this is where we had a really good friend client that was basically a VIP doc, and he made a call. And like the next day, they got me in to see a GI. And it was something where I had a colonoscopy, endoscopy to see if I had, like a gluten intolerance. And the doctor's like, dude, I'm 90% sure you have this. And it's a matter of like, it's not like me telling you is going to change anything. So he's like, I recommend you just take all this stuff out of your diet immediately, because it's going to take weeks to get out of your system. So it was kind of one of those things where it's like, I think I kind of went, obviously like had this life-changing event. Like every day I would eat sandwiches and cereal and bagels. It was literally in every supplement I took, all my protein. You get home, you're like, oh my God, like what the hell do I eat? So for like the next 5 years, I think it's crazy to think back that like back then, like most of my friends didn't even know what the hell gluten was when I said it.
Mhm.
And now it's like, God, everything.
You, you know what I love is my son, he's about to turn 1 year old. For the previous, well, I mean, for the previous year, really, I have this bookshelf that is at his level, so he can take down any of the books that he wants. And the book that he constantly pulls down is Grain Brain. So
Okay.
within the previous week, I was like, all right, man, clearly there's a reason why you keep pulling this out. And I promised you that I would read it next since you keep pulling it. So I dove into that. And it's relevant because I work with a 14-year-old girl that is also dealing with an autoimmune issue. And she just this week mentioned that she was talking about going gluten-free. So I love that we're kind of bringing it up in this discussion here. And I'm gonna let you continue, but with the brain fog and the fatigue that you were experiencing, would you relate that more to like the celiacs that you were experiencing, the gluten insensitivity, or would you relate that more to like the airway? I know they're all related.
So yeah. So this is where like my journey really started. So I would say like 10 years ago, my journey for like figuring out my health, like I would say really began, because it's like I had this autoimmune, but it was like gluten free. I didn't really know what the hell that meant back then. And then it was like for years, I just kind of thought that everything that was still happening to me was somehow related to the celiacs, that I didn't really understand what it was. So it was like, 3, 4 times a year, I might actually go down. I go to a restaurant, I go somewhere, and it was like all of a sudden, you know, I didn't know gluten was in that. I didn't know it was that. But then it was like by about like the end of the second or third year, like I'd read everything I could find back then, and it was like all right, there's something still wrong with me. And this is where I started reading the work of Dr. Karazi, and he's out of Carlsbad. He's a really good functional med doc that basically teaches a lot of other functional med docs like how to test, prescribe, supplementation. And I was like, I remember I tried to work with him back then. I couldn't. So we had a practitioner that worked part-time Montana, part-time Arizona that I started working with. And this is where I would say for the last 5, 6 years, I went every possible functional med test possible. Everything you can imagine, from my cortisol levels, like they have all these different panels by a company called Cyrex where you mail in your blood, and they can look like even like proteins that mimic that of gluten. So it's called a cross-reactive protein test, that there's like 26 foods where the brain and the body can think that it's still getting gluten, even though it's something else, because there's basically a mimicry between the protein makeup of the two, and the body can't make the distinction. So it was like all these things, every supplement regimen. I mean, we're talking, I probably spent a few $100,000 just doctors testing for years. Like you name it, it's like everything. And then it's just like, once again, like I'd probably say back in 2000, what was it, 2019, at the beginning of the year, it was like I got desperate. At the end of 18, I saw this special called Broken Brain, and it was all these top functional med docs. And that was something where I remember I looked up all these doctors after, and it was like a 6-month waiting list. And I remember there was a guy, Thomas Salt, that lived in Minnesota. And I remember like I got on a plane in February because he lived 2 hours away from the airport in a small town. And it was like I could go see him immediately because no one wants to go to Minnesota in the middle of the winter. So like I remember I went and worked for him for 6 months. He did all these crazy tests with like brain caps, everything to look at all my micronutrients, my cortisol levels, all this stuff. And I tried his protocol for probably like 8 or 9 months, and I just felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. And then randomly, the Dr. Karazian that I had wanted to work with, he had just finished a fellowship at Harvard, and he basically had some free time. And I guess anyone in his database was like kind of one of those things where you could have, you could do basically a case workup for $500 or something like that. It's like, send me all your testing, all this stuff. And then I possibly could offer you the opportunity to work with me as a client of mine. So he basically told me I had the most extensive thing that he had ever seen with all my testing. But it was like, I wanted answers. I was like, I want to give him as much info as possible. So I remember my mom, it was like my birthday. My mom's like, I'll pay for it. Just do it. So I remember I did it. And then he offered me the opportunity to work with him as a client. And I remember this was the end of 2019. I flew out there and he did my workup, and it was all day. I think I was there for 8.5 hours. And it was like just me and him in the office, and probably one of the smartest humans I've ever met in my life. Everything you can think of, he went through. And he had basically talked to me before that like he did a lot of these extra credit crazy cases, extreme athletes, people that had traumatic brain injuries, all this stuff. And because I had broken my mandible and gotten a concussion back in 2004, I was like, maybe this is the guy. And so I remember he went through my whole workup. I flew out with my mom for a few days. I remember I'm at the hotel that night. It's like 10:30. He sends me like a 20-page document. That's his workup for me that he had already somehow churned out before He even went to bed that night. And I was like, dude, this guy is awesome. So I think I started doing his protocol, and he basically had all this stuff that basically, says that like if you have a concussion, all these things that happen, if you have traumatic brain injury, you have basically these glial cells in your brain, and all of a sudden they're supposed to be like Pac-Mans where they basically prune all the dead neurons, all that stuff. And he's like, if there's trauma, a lot of times these Pac-Man can turn into bad guys that they're basically eating up good parts of the brain. And he said the problem with issues with brain injury is there's no shutoff valve. So what he had was he had all these flavonoid complexes that he made with like Apex Energetics that like would basically go in and act like a blanket to shut off the inflammation in your brain. Mm-hmm. And so he kind of had these awesome protocols where I was taking all this stuff. And I remember I started doing that for a few months, and it definitely made a difference. And then I remember he did a seminar with 1,000 doctors, and he made me one of his 2 case studies. And it was like basically gut neural connection, all this stuff from trauma. And I remember thinking back then that like, here I was in the middle of a seminar, I guess it was at the very end. And he basically was like, yeah, I think it's from CTE in your brain, which is why you have the brain fog and fatigue. And I remember like just feeling this sense of peace. I remember it was the end of day 1 on Saturday. And I just had a sense of peace that at least someone had told me like what the hell's been going on with me for the last 10, 11 years. And then I think that sat with me. And then I remember I came out of that seminar, and he really drove home the fact about doing like a ketogenic diet, which I was still doing his supplements. I think I did keto where I was unbroken for 10 months. I think right up until like right around like COVID time. Mm-hmm. And it was like all these things. And I was like, now there's still like, I just feel like crap. And it's like, I could have either stuck with that diagnosis, or I think part of me was like, the minute you're a victim of that diagnosis, it's like, that's the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And then randomly I got this new client. She was like a 50-something-year-old lady. She basically taught tennis at one of the private high schools. She had just had a knee replacement, and she wanted like something to go from therapy back to return to sport. And I remember her husband was a functional dentist in Scottsdale. And I remember she started telling me about like what he did. And I still remember I went home that day and I just kind of started looking into it. And I remember I caught a podcast by Chris Kresser where he had Dr. Stephen Lynn. And it was basically like talking about basically oral health and basically our jaw size and what that's done to our health. And that is when I went way hard down the wormhole for Airway. And I feel like up until now, that is kind of what I've gone hard with. But just realizing that like, even if it was like this CTE and I've got celiac disease, it was like at some point it's probably 6 months or a year in realizing like, okay, I have the upper jaw of a 5-year-old. My tongue doesn't fit on my palate. I had a tongue tie, which no one has ever told me in my life. And it's like, it's a bad tongue tie, like my posterior tie. Like I couldn't get the back of my tongue up on the roof of my mouth. And then it's just like, I had broken my nose when I was 6 years old. They didn't fix that. So you start thinking like, all right, I've got a 5-year-old nose, and then one side was almost completely closed. And you're like, dude, how the hell am I breathing? And then I just start to think of like how that tied in with the nervous system. And, so looking back the last 3 years, it's like tonsils, adenoids removed. I have my deviated septum fixed. I've had 2 palate expansions. I started at 28 millimeters. Now I'm at 42. I had a tongue tie release, a year of myofunctional therapy, and I flew out to have the Cowboys ENT do like a nasal valve, basically repair called the Vivair procedure. And I would say now at this point, it's like my airway is double in size, and I feel like I can freaking breathe for the first time in my life. It's crazy to think like at 45 years old, you're like, wow, like I've been in the health game, and it's like, this is the best I've ever like been able to breathe. And it's like crazy to see like my nervous system and just my ability to just relax and breathe and what that's done to change my life. And I think it's like this. If people have ever, like my business partner is one of those guys that like, I feel like he was brought up by a mom who was a hippie. She didn't give him junk food, no soda. And it was like just one of those, she did it right without realizing she was doing anything. That's just how she lived her life. But someone that's like really good size airway as a result, like just grew up really healthy, no health issues, really good balance, stability, body awareness. And it's like, I just realized from all the conversations we have all the time that like people that have never had issues don't know what they're missing. And they can't imagine that something that subtle could make that much of an impact on their life. And we're talking millimeters, millimeters in how wide your nose is, millimeters how long your tongue is, and like what that does from an overall health perspective, I think is crazy. And it's more like when you've never had it and then someone gives it back to you in life, you're like, whoa.
Mhm.
It's like a serious upgrade. You're like, yep.
For the first time in your life, you can actually breathe, and you can actually literally say that.
Yeah. And it's just like people can't understand, like if you have a tongue tie, it's like I still remember like a week after my release, I'm sitting at a light and like all of a sudden I could just feel my tongue on my palate to where the seal was that much better. And all of a sudden you're just like breathing in through your nose and you could just feel the pull of your nose working better. But then it's like you're only aware of that for a week and then it becomes your new
Mhm.
and you don't remember it anymore. But like at some point you're like, wow, like there was a distinct difference in even that little thing that I just did to upgrade me. But it's got a short life and then it becomes your new normal and you don't recognize it anymore. But like I think that's been the crazy thing for all these things that I've done over the last 4 years. Like it's just like all these mini upgrades, just getting my airway to this better and better place. And then just like recognizing through each treatment, whether it's you're having multiple things done or even, you know, I remember even the Excite OSA that stimulates your tongue. It's like, I mean, you wear this thing, it's 20 minutes a day. It basically activates tone in your tongue for
Mhm.
someone that's like, I remember I started, it was like, I think it goes to level 15. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to start at level 10. I remember I put that thing in my mouth, level 10. I was like, holy shit. It was one of those things where I'm like, I don't know if I'll ever be able to do level 10. You know, you like bring yourself back to level 3. And then it's just like, I think it's like half a year later and I've maxed it out. But, you know, it's kind of one of those things where you're like, you just recognize like, I could do 15 now all day long and it doesn't feel like it's doing anything, you know, but then it's like at some point it was like this, I couldn't even handle half that.
So that's crazy, man. It's like you went through all that extensive work, all the supplements, all the protocols, all that testing, hundreds of thousands of dollars, like you stated, and the results that you saw were like minimal. They were negligible compared to this last little bit where you literally just worked on the airway. So,
Yeah, yeah,
and this was overlooked during all that testing. No one even had addressed this. So
never.
I gotta imagine that's the case for any of the listeners that have been dealing with some type of chronic issue where you're not really getting answers no matter what you do. It's like you need to assess how you're actually breathing. And you may not have the anatomical structure to actually breathe properly. So you need to go through procedures like you did.
Yeah, and I feel like that's the hardest. I mean, I was talking to one of my buddies the other day, you know, he's what, 47, you know, something where he's taking some medicines for high blood pressure, still like has a drink or two before bed, might smoke a little just to relax, take the edge off. But it's like, here's this guy that I'm talking about. Like, I was like, dude, you're mild to moderate sleep apnea. I was like, what about trying a CPAP? And it was like, I don't want to do that. And I was like, dude, you're taking drugs and drinking. But like, it's kind of one of those things where like drugs and drinking work for a little, but then like everything hits its end. And it's like when you hit the end and you're only 60 and there's nothing else left to help you, you're just like your mental health and your love for life. I just watch people every day. Like my gym, we train the wealthiest of wealthy. And at some point, these people have all the money in the world, but they can't buy their health back. And it's like, what is the point in getting there and then like not enjoying the rest of your life?
Mhm.
And it's almost like painful to watch these people. They're so miserable and they can't even see it. But like at that point, they're so against doing anything to help themselves. And I remember I said to my buddy, I was like, dude, what about wearing a CPAP? And he's like, that wouldn't be fair to my wife. And I was like, really, bro? If you told your wife that it's going to give you 10 years more in your back end of life, it's going to help your blood pressure, really? And then I was like, dude, you can't even hear those things. I've had one. I was like, you know how I know you don't want it to work for you? Because I'm like, you're not even asking questions about it. You've already shut it down. But that's most people. Most people are like, I have sleep or breathing problems. And they're like, I don't want to have a surgery and I don't want to wear a CPAP. And it's like, that's like a weight loss client coming to me and be like, yeah, I don't want to change how I eat and I don't really want to work out. I'm like, what the hell do you want me to do?
Well, I'm curious if that goes into what we were talking about prior to the intro, where it's like how you were talking about your previous self when you were like in your 20s or something like that. If you can go back, now that you can actually breathe and now that you can actually chill, people are going to be extremely reactive. And this is if they can't breathe properly. And this is something that I actually noticed with nutrition. So whenever I would have clients come in and they would quote unquote cheat and they would eat junk foods or whatever it is, number one, I would see that they would like swell up. So one day from the next, I would be able to see their kneecaps, and then the next day I wouldn't be able, like they'd be all puffy. That's what I would consider.
Yeah.
And whenever I would try to mention anything like this to them and bring it to their awareness, it was like shut down immediately, very reactive. So and food, for those that aren't listening, I guess we can get in that next. Um, Obviously, you were dealing with some celiac issues, gluten sensitivities, all that, but nothing really got better till you fixed your airways. But what I want to talk about is how did we get here then? Why does the furniture not fit? Why is the plumbing, why is our airways constricted, restricted? You mentioned the hippie mother before, how she didn't intentionally do so, but by not introducing the processed junk foods or any of the soft foods, which would be like the grains, the breads, which don't what am I looking for? Don't encourage mastication. We don't have to chew anymore. We don't have the hard foods. Like, how did we get here? Why
Yeah.
your jaw the size of a 5-year-old's?
Yeah. Like, I mean, and like to make this clear, because I feel like the one thing I hate talking about in this world, the world of Airway, is like this breastfeeding. And I feel like, any moms listening, there's no shame in this. I've changed the context in which I talk about it. It's like if I talk about a child from day one when they're born, and I want to get them to like pro athlete status at age 3. So from an optimal performance, breathing, thriving in life, what do I want them to do? I think number one thing is breastfeeding. It literally stimulates all the muscles of mastication. And I think the two most important things it does is one, it teaches the child how to seal the palate. So I think one of the interesting things I've learned from Sandra Kahn, she's like really awesome dentist out of Mexico. She talks about like the physics of fluids. So within our oral cavity, there's basically like the hard palate and the soft palate, like the front of the mouth, the back of the mouth. And basically, when we swallow, if our tongue sits on the palate and we swallow, after a few swallows, we'll basically seal off the front and the back of the cavity, almost like it's two caves. So they call them like oral compartments. And the minute these two oral compartments are basically set, it's like it protects your airway from collapsing. So I like to think of like an airway, almost like a pumpkin. Like the minute you have a brand new pumpkin, it's kind of like at 4 weeks old, all of a sudden it's losing its structure. Everything's kind of caving in. You've lost your structural integrity. And what basically breastfeeding does is it teaches a child the minute you latch on and they swallow once or twice, they can't unlatch without like basically uncoupling. So the fact that they're like literally tethered, like basically like a fuel line going into the side of a plane or a car, it's literally like because they're tethered to that extreme, it forces the two oral compartments to seal and teaches nasal breathing.
Hmm.
So one of the things I can't really find studies on is like I don't really know how a child that's not breastfed really learns how to seal the palate. Because it's like you think of like nature basically breastfeeding, it's this nature's way of teaching the inherent patterns that are going to allow the child to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
So then it becomes this whole thing where it's like, I don't really know like how we learn as children to sustain those oral compartments if we never actually swallow off of a breast, because the physics isn't the same when you're feeding off of a bottle. So there tends to be this, you can breathe through your mouth the entire time you're feeding on a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
So then the physics changes, and I'm interested because it's like, you know, there's some people out there that have never been bottle fed or they've never been breastfed, but like they're nose breathers. And as I'm really interested in that part, I think, obviously there's the ethical side of studies to basically, you're never going to get children to basically, not have them breastfeed to see what happens. But I think there's definitely this, you could do a retro study for people that are open to it. Like, those that weren't breastfed, but they're still nasal breathers, like who are they and how were they successful at still becoming a nose breather in life? What else was done to make up for that? I feel like it creates this deficit. The same type of thing happens for a preemie baby that's born at like 6 or 7 months. They miss out on that third trimester with optimal physics. And then oftentimes this child isn't breastfeeding. They have all kinds of issues. And then it's like, how do we take this human and how do we catch them up knowing what we know today? Because I think there could be a mom today that's like, she's been basically bottle feeding her kid for a year since birth. But it's like, okay, shit, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that from an optimal standpoint. How do I now catch my child up? Or what things can I do 100% right to kind of help facilitate better growth? So the two things that I've seen from the best talking about this is one, like the breastfeeding component. And then, I've heard Dr. Khan, I've heard basically Dr. Liu talk about like the baby-led weaning is the second component. It's kind of like, basically a few hundred years ago, we didn't have mush, we didn't have slop. And it's like, what are we doing for these children when we start to basically take them off the teat and we're starting to introduce foods, and for some, like there's a Dr. Courtney, she's a dentist out of Chicago. She just talked about, stuff where it's like things that are going to stimulate a lot of chewing
Mm-hmm.
without basically causing any irritation to the gums. But usually children, like they basically have two separate airways, and until basically the airway becomes one at 18 or 20 months, like these kids aren't going to choke. So this is where like hard beef jerky, like frozen or hard like peaches, different foods that are good quality, but they're going to force your child to chew a lot versus I'm going to give them all these pouches of goo and juice and all this stuff. And Dr. Felix Lau, the 6 foot tiger, 3 foot cage, like he talks about green smoothies, bone broth, a lot of like grass fed, like meat, stuff that's causing a child, when they're slightly old enough, but what things can we do? And it's interesting because it's like, you still will have these. I've listened to some of these people talk about they do everything right, and it's like still trying to gauge like where is their kid relative to every other kid that's 2.5 or 3 years old, from like a palate size or a nasal breathing. And it's interesting because like I think Dr. Courtney's 4.5 year old was at like 32 millimeters, and then she expanded her daughter, and I think before she even hit 5, she was at 38 millimeters. And to be clear, like most people might not have context to like the width of the palate being 38 millimeters. That's bigger than every male trainer that works for me at my gym. But same thing for my niece. My niece is 12. Okay, so for 2 years she lived in Oregon, and I remember last Halloween I was out there in San Jose, and I had measured up probably about 100 people in my gym, and I was like, yeah, I'm just curious context wise. And I remember I measured my niece, and my niece was 38 millimeters, same thing. And she's like, oh yeah, uncle, when I was like 7 in Oregon, they put like this expander in me, and you're just thinking like that's all it takes. Like I didn't even know she was expanded. But it's like here's a child that's like, you know, just by doing this simple thing early in life, and it's like you just set a child's airway up. And it's like one of my guys is literally, he just turned 32. He's severe sleep apnea. He's probably like 6% body fat. He was a pro golfer, and it's like he severe apnea, has a night guard, has a CPAP. I've got another guy that's 29, deadlift 500 pounds, and he wakes up every day. TMJ on the left side, his jaw's locked for 20 minutes. But it's like, these are grown, healthy men that like there's already writing on the wall. Mm-hmm. And then it's just like, how many of these things can be addressed at a young age? And it's like, it's crazy. Like I had 3 posts from last night. I had 3 moms reach out, and they each had 5-year-olds that all had jaws of 40 millimeters plus because they've already expanded their kids. You're like, dude, that is insane. Had braces 4 times. They removed 4 adult teeth, 4 wisdom teeth, and I've had braces. I've had 2 expanders, and I'm at 42. And here are these little 5-year-old kids. They're already at the same place as me, and I'm like, dude, they might not ever need anything ever again, even braces. And you're like, dude, that's nothing at a young age. And then it's like, you've just gifted this child these things that they don't even know they won't have, but it's like they are light years ahead of their friends. Mm-hmm. And I think it all comes back to this, because I don't know how you're a medical doctor, and if most people you see every day come in with an airway that's 30 to 40%, and maybe around 30 years old, their system blew out because they've been trying to run a V10 off of a V4 or V6. Like they now are overbreathed. Their nervous system has been taxed. They blew it out years ago. And it's like, how could you possibly be healthy? But then it's like, how can we really pull apart symptoms from whatever someone's dealing with today if we literally just don't account for this one thing? That's like, dude, you just put Michael Jordan on the bench and you're talking about winning a championship. You're like, why would you put Michael Jordan on the bench? And I mean, that's what we're doing when we dismiss the importance of the airway for people when it comes to their health. And I think it just becomes this spider web where it just becomes so intertwined with everything else. But it's like, I think one of the major issues is we've got a medical system that has a solution to a lot of things that falls into the dental world. So the solution to the problem doesn't even lie within the same system. How are you supposed to get people the right help?
So you need an integrated system.
Yeah, and it's just like, I feel like it's like, think of like dentists, right? Like they probably charge 5x, 7x. It's like people tell you they have dental insurance, but it's like, yeah, maybe you save $1,000 on braces or something. It's not like you're getting pretty much most of your dental work for free if you're getting 3 crowns. It's maybe at 25% off, but I feel like, I don't know if dentists would want to go into the medical world. I wouldn't. Why would you give up and go into the world of playing reimbursement when you've got like the cash is king. But I feel like this, like if you don't give every 3-year-old access to an airway that we can no longer get by doing things naturally, how can we give anyone and humanity a chance at thriving from a health perspective when everyone's already starting behind the 8 ball?
Mhm. So you go after the moms, by the way, and you're gonna have like pitchforks outside your door. So sorry if after releasing this, all of a sudden you get a lot of hate mail or anything like that. But
Yeah.
so it starts with breastfeeding. I guess like you said, the mechanism doesn't really exist there for the bottle feeding. And it'd be interesting if you were to actually ask those clients that you have if they were breastfed as kids. So it's a kind of way to like back test right
Yeah,
there.
yeah. And
Like,
I do, like, I mean, I ask all of them. So it's like, and it's kind of like this. It's like more for me, it's like I would love to meet like people that have, like, are there people that are in their 30s or 40s that weren't breastfed, but it's like, what are their jaws 40 millimeters? Like, how did you get there? Like, it's more like, I feel like you could have these superseding genetics. There's outlier genetics. It's like, where are you from? It's like, well, if my dad's dad and his dad and my mom's dad all had like jaws of super athletes, it's like, well, like then it's in your DNA, right? So you could have some seriously compromising stuff and still be okay. You're like, yeah, I got LeBron DNA. I'm good. It's like I could throw some of this away and still be good on the court. Whereas like I think some of us come from this background of like, you didn't have, let's just say, A grade DNA coming in this situation. Maybe some of us starting with a B or C grade, and then it's just like, and everything wasn't done right, which
mhm,
doesn't leave much room for things not being done optimally in order to give you a decent chance at thriving. And that's like the coolest thing about like dynamic systems theory is like seeing like how all these different elements fit into the big picture. And it's like it's never as easy saying this or this. It's like there's so many compounding factors. And like this is where like this diagram I've been working on for the last few months, it's like just taking the major factors into play as far as like, air quality, breastfeeding, baby led weaning, does a child use a pacifier? And then it's just like, I mean, this diagram, I was only like talking about the first 3 years. And then it's like, well, what happens the rest of the time? Do we have trauma to our teeth? It's like, are we growing up in a house full of mold and like, we just get all these autoimmune issues due to stuffy noses. And, so you could have a great jaw going into 5, 6 years old, and then you move to the East Coast and your basement floods, and then you've got black mold in your house until you're 20. And, it's like, what does that do to your system? And it's like, it's just this interesting thing as far as how we all evolved to kind of where we are.
mhm. So it could start when you were born, whether you weren't breastfed, or it could be something afterwards. But the moral of the story is the width of your jaw. Like I think it's the intermolar width that you measure.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like basically your top jaw and the maxilla, it's like from the inside edge. And there's different landmarks on the teeth that they'll use to describe like the ML cusps or whatnot. But just kind of, yeah, like on the first set of molars on your upper jaw, that basically shows your width of the nasal cavity. But this is where there's a famous uh, researcher, Dr. McNamara, that did basically followed all these groups of kids back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he did all these crazy data. And the one number that he found was statistical significance was the intermolar width as it related to long-term health, like these different things.
Mhm.
And and then it's like now you got guys like Dr. Boyd, who I think is one of the best pediatric uh, orthodontist dentists in the country out of Chicago. But I mean, he's talking about like, dude, just a gestational ultrasound where they're looking at a child that's like still in the womb and you can already see a recessed jaw. And it's
Mm.
like, dude, it's like, dude, they know all this stuff. And it's more of like, you know, I guess there's there's a knowing all these things matter, and then it's like, can you do anything about it? And then do you do anything about it? So I think my biggest goal is always like, I always talk about this optimal opportunity to thrive, not from shaming or this and that. It's more of like to make the world aware that like this is like what I know to be the best that you can do to give your child. It's like I'm a trainer, but it's like, yeah, I eat pizza and I drink alcohol, and it's like it's one of those things where it's like, just because I'm aware of good nutrition doesn't mean I eat perfect. So I think like for moms or whatever, it's like, there's all these factors. I think it's more like looking back, like it's amazing to me how many clients of mine that like they thought that like they were told by their doctor that like bottle feeding was better for their kids. Like this is like purely I didn't know. And then it was like, some of the marketing were geared at moms to like make them think that like we've got extra ingredients that you're not getting in your breast milk. And it's like it's just hard out there. There's so much misinformation.
Mhm.
And I'm someone that's like, listen, like I'm always open to learning. Like tell me if I said something wrong, like I'm gonna learn something. Like maybe something I said was taken out of context, but my goal is always like this. Let's push the world and humanity forward by pushing the right information.
Mhm.
And I think nowadays with influencer, I feel like there's lack of awareness and understanding, and then there's basically lack of integrity. And I think we see a lot of lack of integrity today on making the quick buck. And, it's a lot of stuff that's just geared at treating symptoms rather than actually going at the cause and helping people understand and seeing what is the underlying issue.
Mhm. People, they like the shiny stuff, and just because it looks good doesn't mean it is good with all the influencers. So I totally agree with like the integrity. So I like that you mentioned like how people are told that, oh, formula is better. Like we're offering you stuff that you don't have in your breast milk. Like breast milk is going to be the top tier stuff. Like that's the way that nature intended it. And I believe that there was actually a boycott of Nestle over in Africa.
Yeah.
There's an article I think called "The Baby Killer," where
Yeah. Reddit is, yeah.
yeah, and so it goes from the bottle feeding. Now we're marketed the mushy gushy stuff, the Gerber babies. My baby looks like a Gerber baby, and I will tell you, he doesn't eat mushy stuff. I feed him a steak. He chews on the shrimp. He's a badass. He's gonna have, I hope, I pray, a decent jaw. And I find that at times, and I've mentioned on your post, where if I catch him napping, I believe I read it in the "Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Life" book.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Native Americans, the women, they would push the chin up because that habit starts early. And to go back a little bit, what would be the difference between like someone that wasn't breastfed, because I wasn't breastfed, as I mentioned before, like can we correct this now and become a nasal breather later effectively? I remember back when I was 26, it was about 7 years ago. I was dealing with a whole bunch of anxiety issues at the time. I was not eating the greatest, but something told me just stick my tongue to the roof of my mouth, like behind my two front teeth. I just did it. I shut my mouth. I shut up, and I calmed down immediately, and I just kept this practice going. But reading or going through some of your posts, I've actually been practicing now because I realized that sure, I can get my tongue up on the front palate, which I think would be the soft palate, or would that would be the front of the mouth?
The hard palate. So that'd be your anterior hard palate would be in the front.
Okay, so I can get my tongue easily up to the front part, the hard palate, but if I try the posterior, it's pretty difficult. I can do it,
Got it.
but it's pretty challenging. So I'm like, is this something that is trainable naturally, or do you feel like people would need to go through the expansions such as you did or the braces?
No,
How?
no. So like I would say this, like, so there's a few things there, right? There's
Mhm.
the you can have a tie, tongue tie, lip tie. I know you'd sent me some questions. So like just getting this, like, so like there's think of like a tie, like a leash, right? Like there's let's just say there's an optimal length that the leash should be to let your dog thrive. Well, if it's short, your dog's not going to get much exercise if they're stuck on the leash all day. It's like the same with the tongue. So if the tongue doesn't have enough length on it to be able to push the jaw and keep pushing it to an adequate size, I'm never going to grow my jaw to that size unless it's cut. So you can have an anterior tie a lot of times, which can limit, front of the tongue, all that stuff, tip of the tongue getting to the roof of the mouth. And then oftentimes, like I had a posterior tie, which means you basically have a hard time getting the back of the tongue up on the soft palate. So I always tell people, like, if you thought of like let's just say, like, here's the soft palate, like it's almost like I want the back of the tongue. I want to put a dime on the back of my tongue, and I want to like press it up into the soft palate, like I'm trying to stamp the dime through my soft palate in the back so I can get that suction. And then it's kind of like, this is where you could actually start to, let's just say you don't have a tie, it's just more of a you've never done it. So this is where you could start to train that. So you could literally start to do, so it's called like the caves movement or the lingual palatal suction, where you can literally just start to do like holds. And what you'll start to find is you can create better tension in the muscle, and your tongue will tone. And this is where you'll start to see like more length, as far as the freedom will get longer while still keeping the tongue up on the palate, almost like a forklift. So your tongue basically just does this, and the freedom should basically be able to just, it looks like a string in the middle. And this is how they evaluate like a posterior tie. They'll look at like, based on if you can keep the back of the tongue up on the palate, like this is something the Breathe Institute, Dr. Zaghi has done an amazing job, where it's like just looking at basically the height of the opening to evaluate it. But it's not like you have one or not. They'll just give you you sit on a spectrum. So a tie often is like there's a severity to optimal versus and this is where they'll grade it. And then it's like, if you fall into grade 3, grade 4, like, okay, this is severe in the sense that it's going to hinder function. And then it's like anything, right? We have plenty of high level athletes in my gym, and it's like they might make moves that like should be hurting their body, but they're not in pain. So it's kind of like something where it's like, well, if it's not broke and you're not having any negative symptoms, do we need to do anything about it?
Yeah, you don't know how it might be limiting you. You don't know if you
Yeah,
could be.
and it's like there's always the other side of a botched surgery. So
So I was actually practicing. I don't know if you noticed while you
yeah, oh yeah,
showing me that.
I saw.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know where I stand. I guess there. I guess I would need to evaluate it. But so who would you go to again for that?
So I'll tell you this, dude, it's awesome. Probably like 50 minutes worth of your time. You'll learn a lot if you're interested. So go to YouTube and Zaghi, the Breathe Institute. It's called like 5 Dimensions of a Tongue Tie. And he basically walks through the different testing they do as far as that. And I think there's a good way for you to evaluate it, because there's different things. Like you could have a limitation in the posterior part of your tongue, or you could have like a compensation where like the floor of your mouth elevates as a result of the tie. So it can present itself in different ways. If you watch that, you'd have a pretty good idea of like how to evaluate yourself. And I'm not saying people should evaluate themselves. Like obviously, like I literally think like the Breathe Institute is one of the best in the world to look at tongue ties. That's often my advice I give. Like I gave it to a mom yesterday, because one of the things I think is I've seen a lot of dentists and stuff. They're really comfortable looking in an anterior tie, like because it's visible. And oftentimes, like a posterior tie, especially for a little baby, can be harder to recognize. When you're talking about like a child having issues with latching or issues with gas in the stomach, I think that's important. That's the one distinction I tell like a lot of people is like, ask them how many posterior ties that they've removed or released in the last year, because I think it gives context to like that they have enough understanding and awareness when it comes to that to assess it.
Mhm. They just have
Otherwise, when people are like, you're
like,
good.
yeah,
Yeah.
cut
And you're
your
like,
arm off.
yeah.
So, so you've had it done. What's the recovery like? What does that feel like? Does it hurt? Is it painful?
So you do like, it's like anything, right? Like training, right? You're going to end range training for prior to going so that your nervous system is basically kind of ready for said event. But it was literally like got on a plane 6 a.m. I think I was like in the Breathe Institute office by noon. I literally was there for less than 30 minutes, in and out. They did the release, probably less than 15 minutes in a chair. And then it was like I took an Uber. I went to get some cranial sacral work from someone they recommended. And then I was back home that night. And I ate what I would normally eat. I
Hmm.
know some people might not feel comfortable, but it was like the only thing I felt was like the next 2 nights, I woke up once or twice where it was like I could feel the stitches in my tongue. And it was just like this. I woke up thinking about it. That was it. Went back to sleep.
Hmm.
And then it was like a matter of a few days. I didn't feel anything once the stitches were out of my tongue. And then it was like, I literally did myo for the next, I think, 5 or 6 weeks with one of their therapists. Like, I did a check in like 3 days later, 2 days later, and then, just kept doing my stuff.
Hmm.
But this is one of those things where it's like, I literally think from when I had my jaw broken, that my jaw is like spun from when I had it broken. And so as a result, when they fixed or when and released the tie, like I literally think they could only get some of it because my jaw is still twisted. So my
Hmm.
hopes now with my orthodontist, he's trying to help me kind of realign my TM joints to where I can get them to track better. And I think I'd actually go back in and to get more of my posterior tie released so that I can get my entire tongue out of the roof of my mouth.
Hmm. And that's the way that our tongue should be normally when we're just nasal breathing. So it should be, because you mentioned, I think in your post that it feels like a vacuum, like when you swallow. So
Yeah.
once you have your tongue on the palate, on the roof of your mouth,
Uh-huh.
then you do like 3 swallows and it creates this vacuum. That's how it should be like throughout the day.
So let's just say no. So let's just say you wanted to optimally nasal breathe. You're on a bike. Obviously, if you're like at your job, it's kind of like you're talking and stuff like that. You're not going to like tongue on the roof of the mouth. But like I've learned that it's really weird. I was a mouth breather my whole life, right? So you've always got your mouth hanging open, like hey. And now I think it's funny because I feel like people think I have a serious face all the time, and it's like because I'm not opening my mouth because I know I should be nose breathing. But it's weird. It's like this society, like, does this person think I'm being like Mr. Serious over here? But it's like, dude, but like, it's like realizing that. But yeah, like, so like, if you think of like this, like basically your teeth right here, like, so your tongue should sit just shy, like a millimeter or two behind. And then it basically should press, the front of the tongue should press right on the incisive papilla, which is right behind that, basically the front teeth. And then it should press the whole tongue kind of up. And what that does is once the tongue sits up and I swallow a few times, then I seal off the anterior compartment and the posterior compartment. And that's where it's important that you have the seal on the lips, as well as you've got front of the tongue and the back of the tongue. And this is where it's like you can't seal both compartments to have the optimal pressure to protect the airway and hold it open if
Mhm.
you have a tongue tie or a lip tie. But like ideally, you want that basically tongue sitting up there all day long and breathing out of your nose. But then it's like, let's just say I put you on an assault bike or you're going to go for a 5 mile run and you're going to run anything shy of 70%. It's like tongue should sit on the roof of the mouth. You should probably get a few swallows. And then it's like, I mean, you should just be like a solid, like a vacuum with flow to it.
Hmm.
So that
So,
was the one thing I was just kind of one thing I was telling one of my staff members. I think it's like this, like I think most people put tongue to the roof of their mouth, right? So if this is like my top palate, I'm not just pushing my tongue, but my tongue is basically pressing up And then I'm also pressing it forward, because if I press my upper jaw out and up, I just took my teeth and it's like I opened the back of my airway. So, think of like posterior expansion of a joint. So it's like the minute my tongue presses up and forward, it's like something just pressurized. And what that does is open the back of the airway. So that's where it's like you get this, that's where the vacuum effect comes. So it's not just pushing it up, it's pushing it up and forward, which opens the back of the throat to really allow air to move through the airway.
Hmm. I'm still practicing as you're mentioning all this, so it seems pretty difficult. It's almost like my tongue is weak, so I don't know if I have a tongue tie and I need to evaluate it. So I'll check that out afterwards.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious how this would apply to my training. So with athletic performance training, or even like Gen Pop, now that you've gotten into this whole airway health, how do you go about assessing clients? Like, how important, where does this sit on your needs analysis for them?
It's like I
Walking
think
the door?
there's those that are open to it right up front. I think it's like you get a feel for like a new client, right? Like, where does this fit?
Mhm.
I think the coolest thing is I think we have a lot of people on my staff, or people like today, right? This 17-year-old kid is like talking about like airway and all this stuff. He's asking questions. And little does he know that his trainer is the one that has severe apnea. And like I said, he's like 6% body fat. And he's like, "What do you mean you have sleep apnea?" But like, it's like, so like, how do you just start to tee these things up for people so they start to have awareness? And I think it's like anything, right? There's some people that will like, you just get a feel that like, all right, we're not going there today. And then there's other people that are like, yeah, I'm completely open to any advice you have for me being more healthy human. And
Mhm.
then it's like, where on the spectrum does that person fit? Or maybe it's kind of like you bring it into when it seems to be a good fit for that session. Because I think there's the explaining to people, like I like to work with like a lot of like high level young female athletes. And oftentimes what I see with them is like a hypermobile. So super
Mhm.
high level, like D1 or professional female golfers. And it's like oftentimes they're hypermobile. So then they're stuck with this elevated rib cage and a pelvis that's dumped with forward head posture. And they lack the ability to create intra-abdominal tension and feel and access muscles the way, let's just say, most guys do that are the same age as them. But it's like teaching them how to reposition their body and use the tongue to basically create internal pressure to the body. And it's like I always think of the tongue, like explain to people, like for someone that's hypermobile, it's like the flap on the inside of a toilet. If you don't seal the flap to where the water can fill, it just keeps running and there's no pressure in the toilet. That's your hypermobile athlete. And then I explain it like you take one of those balloons out in front of a new business. It's like
Mhm.
posturally, they are the balloon with nothing in it, or a super low level. And it's like if you want to create force production, speed, power, you want your brain to sense where you are in space. You need pressure to have low level activation of the muscles so that your brain can know where the hell you are. But
Mhm.
it's like if nothing's ever really on because you're there's no footprint that the brain and the body can sense because there's no pressure in the balloon, how do you really know where you are? And it's like these are like things that they're like, oh, no one's ever asked me that. And it's like more of like a the good thing is I've had a number of girls that I've worked with that have like been through it, and it's like a year later, I have a girl I work with, she's a dental hygienist, and it's like she came in with back pain, and it's 5 weeks later, she's 26, she's like, holy shit, it like I now will subconsciously like catch myself walking through my house, like I feel my feet and like I can feel my hamstrings. And it's like just this like it the tongue and where the head sits sets the body up for so much success in so many ways from a function standpoint, it's not even funny. So there's the breathing side, and then there's the sensory, doing human stuff, balance, lifting stuff, carrying stuff, doing our job, anything physical. It's like, if you don't really have optimal, I like to compare it to like bars on a cell phone. It's like you only get 1 out of 5 activation of all your muscles in your body. How are you really doing anything well?
It kind of seems like we're being attacked on both fronts. And what I mean by this is I do all my work barefoot. I transitioned to that like probably 4 to 5 years ago. And the reason for that would be, for those that are watching this on video, I don't know if you could see it. So with the elevated heel lift, what it's going to do, this on this side would be flat shoes, and then this would be typical modern day footwear with a heel lift. So Nike, Adidas, whatever it may be, all the running shoes. It's going to shift your center of gravity forward. So now in order to actually stack or try to get some type of alignment, your body has to compensate in order to do so. And for the most part, it's going to throw you into that forward head posture. So not only are our jaws being weakened, like through bottle feeding, how that's propaganda through the media, and then the soft foods, it's like our jaws are weak, and also we're kind of being attacked from the ground up. I'm not sure how aware you are of like barefoot training, but it's all
I've been doing it forever, dude. That's like, I probably say half people at our gym, but it's
right.
like I'm a big Ido Portal, Mike Fitch. I mean, I think that's a big thing. Like Carol, there's just a lot of great. I think you look at the best in the world as far as people with their body, right? Martial arts, dancers. What do they all do? It's barefoot. And it's like, if you don't have a sense of grounding and where you are in space, like how are you doing anything from a functionality? And I think there's also the safety factor, right? When the nervous system feels grounded and safe, it can do its thing. And it's like, I think that's very important from, it's like this subconscious, you wouldn't even know it, but like, I'm sure the brain doesn't feel safe for those that can't really express their body very well because they can't feel it.
Literally, like you're numbing out. You can't feel the ground, and you can even see this with children too. I keep my kid barefoot. I really don't want to put shoes on him, but I'll see it with like my niece or any other toddler where they're in shoes and they walk around like this. Or it's like if you put socks on a cat or a dog, like they're gonna be walking all weird. There's a reason for that. Their body is telling you, but they can't communicate this to you. Like, hey, please stop doing this stupid thing to me. I'm trying to breathe. And I think it leads to the over breathing, this whole pattern. So when you aren't grounded, when you don't know where you are in space, what other option do you have than to be in this chronic state of fight or flight?
Oh, it's like, dude, they're just tentacles, right? Your feet, your hands. It's like, dude, they're just feeding information to the brain. I know, like, what is it? Carol Dweck, she has her book where she talks about like barefoot training versus like shoes, and like basically like shows on like one of those things that presses all the metal pins. And it shows that the brain basically when it's stepping on a rock in shoes, and it's like just this big X in the brain versus the feeling the undulations and the entire body shifting when you're barefoot. It's like, yeah, that's like the number one thing I think, especially older clients, like just get them in. I'm like, yeah, get your shoes off. They're like, am I going to be okay? You're like, yeah, pretty sure you're born that way and you're going to die with no shoes on. But
Isn't that crazy that that's the question that comes up? And that's the way that I see it almost subconsciously with shoes. I know this isn't a shoes episode, but I've done plenty of episodes in the past regarding it's like for you to step out into the world, you need some type of protection. That's what you are telling your body subconsciously. You cannot go out into the world without numbing out and disconnecting. So bigger message there. So all right, back to the breathing. So overall, why is it so important for people to be nasal breathing? Like, what are the detrimental effects of being a mouth breather? I know we talked about jaw structure. So can can make for a narrower jaw. What else do we have going on here?
I think like number one is like having access to the diaphragm. Just first of all, if my tongue doesn't sit on my palate, my head can't sit over my shoulders from a posture. So the minute my tongue comes down off the palate, my head is no longer supported. And oftentimes people like an overbite, like basically the head's going to come forward. And then it's just like basically a top down domino effect on the posture. So tongue comes down because it can't breathe through the nose. So the nasal resistance is too high. So tongue comes down, head shifts, ribs, pelvis, everything shifts. And then it's just like, I've lost leverage to access in my lungs. And so this is where like the whole PRI, I mean, it's more like the body is going to figure out how to get through life, but it doesn't mean it's in an optimal way. And when my posture shifts, I lose optimal access to that which I was born with, and I'm going to compensate. And the more mobility or function and variability that I lose, the less access I have to optimal. And this is where we just keep compensating off compensations until we just hit these walls and we can't figure out like where things went wrong. But the minute I lose access to my diaphragm, I no longer have good control over respiration and basically optimizing my ability to utilize oxygen. I lose the diaphragm, I lose access to basically diaphragmatic breathing. I will shift to upper chest breathing. And this is where I will be robbed of basically the balanced nervous system effects because I'm 2x or 3x over breathing. Like you had asked me about like the Bolt score, kind of basically like I can't sustain high enough levels of CO2 to optimize the oxygen in my body. Part of that is I don't have access to my diaphragm. I'm taking short, quick breaths because I can't, when I don't have access to my diaphragm, I can't exhale all the air out. If I can't get it all out, I can't make room for breathing new air in. So these are a lot of people basically have all this air that's like dead air. It's taking up space, but we can't get more air in because we can't get it all out. And when I lose access to the diaphragm, I lose the ability to pump out the bad stuff to make room for the good stuff. So now all of a sudden, I've lost my ability to breathe well. My tongue not sitting on the palate doesn't allow me to get vagal stimulation in my nervous system from a parasympathetic being able to rebalance the nervous system. And then through all my research and understanding, like Dr. Avram Gold, that he did my sleep doctor in New York, he helped me for like a year, just sending me paper after paper that this guy's been in the game for like 40 years, is like when we lack the ability to nasal breathe in sleep, we start to have flow limitations. It's like a clog in a pipe. And at any point that I either stop breathing completely or I have this basically increased respiration rate because I have labored breathing when I'm sleeping, all these things start to change the architecture of our sleep. So there's like this ideal, and then there's apneas, hypopneas, all this stuff where it's like they'll just start to take our body and drop us down levels to where we're just being robbed every hour of sleep. And this is where you start to talk about like learning disabilities, autoimmune, all these things. It's like you basically are waking, you have the inability now to buffer inflammation. We have the inability to optimize cognitive function and skill development because we're not basically getting good restorative sleep. And from a functionality standpoint, it's like I think this is where we just have these issues. So it's going to be the breathing during the day all day long. Your body is just not optimally functioning. And then it's like, so now we're not functioning well, and now we lack the ability to recover at nighttime. And it's like, it just doesn't clean up. And it's like we can get away with murder when we're in our 20s and early 30s. And then I think the stress of life coupled with sleeping less, quality sleep, and all these things, coupled with the fact that like our body is just becoming less and less efficient every day due to age.
Mhm. So with the overbreathing and the posture, we're chronically stuck in this inhaled state. So your inhale would be uh, tied to your sympathetic nervous system. Your exhale would be more related to your parasympathetic nervous system. So parasympathetic would be rest and digest for those that are listening to this. So when we're chronically overbreathing, when we're chest breathers, we don't have access to our diaphragm. And this is something that I even realized when I was taking the PRI courses. I really struggled, even being a nasal breather, to get a full exhale. So it's like we're stuck on an inhale for the most part. We're never actually breathing in fresh air. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just like, yeah, it's kind of like, just hearing Ron talk about it time and time again. It's like, there's another one for you. So their webinars, he does a 9-week COVID series, and it's all on breathing. And it's just like, I mean, just things that people don't recognize, that like how much even our arm swing affects the piston effect of us moving air in the ribs and pelvis. And it's just like, these are simple human functions that I think like, we lose access to as a result of posture. And then we're not even doing human things anymore. And it just like accumulates, like as far as like, and I think it's like, if we can't exhale and then we don't even have any lymphatic, I think that's another thing too. It's like, well, my tongue doesn't sit on my palate. My TMJ joints basically like don't sit in a good balanced place. And then as a result, at the base of the skull, where the brainstem and the cranial nerves come through, like I have this inability to basically get optimal expansion compression when it comes to everything in the brain and all that stuff. And like we just lose this efficiency in all these little places in our body. And then over time with age, it's like, it just seems like it's not just one thing, it's like 86 little things that you just let go sideways 14 years ago. And now it's like, it's just a lot.
Mm-hmm. And it's all literally tied back to posture and breathing.
Yeah.
So do you do any breath work in your sessions, like before you start your clients up?
Yeah, like I'd say this, like I think a lot of times it's I will either bring it into my training as far as like hey, we're gonna go 2 minutes on the assault bike, or I'll program intervals, stuff like that, with just making sure people are nasal breathing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think oftentimes it's like if a client just needs a down day from a recovery standpoint or whatnot, it's more of like I'll tend to go that route with I think one of the hardest things I've learned for myself is like getting to where I am today with all the breathing stuff, and then realizing like when you've had clients for a long time, you didn't bring that in the beginning. If they're not really open and asking about it, it's really hard to come 5 years in and like bring it back in.
Mm-hmm.
So, but like we've got a cold plunge at my gym. So it's like, I think, yeah, 2 of my clients today, like, 3 to 5 minutes in the cold plunge. I think there's like because I think there's breath work I always put into like 2 categories. There's the woo-woo side of breath work. And I think a lot of your guys that might not buy into that, they can justify like a cold plunge, which in my mind is doing a lot of the same things. And then there's the basically running tape on yourself, by watching your thoughts and meditating with breath work. And I think like the 2 sides are huge. I just think like I think certain people are very open to that, and others are like, we're not going there. Mm-hmm. But it's like if you can weave some Navy SEAL-esque things into breathing, I think you can get most people on board.
You say the cold plunge is almost like a form of it, because if you're going to actually sit in the tub for 3 to 5 minutes, the only way that you're going to last is if you're actually exhaling, like if you're calming down your breath. Because if you're
because it's like you ain't going to make it in the tub. you can do whatever the hell you want. You ain't gonna stay in there for 5 minutes if you don't literally just like accept the fact that it's cold, it sucks, and like you got to do something with your breathing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you're gonna figure it out real quick. But I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I'm gonna drop 5 grand on a tub when I could get in my shower for free. I could do the same thing, lay on my floor, but it's like we have this culture that needs this challenge thing, and we got to put this spin on it and market it to go do something we have access to any moment of the day ever.
It's not fancy enough.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, basic. That's why I like being in the game for like this long. It's like I don't care anymore. It's like I'm not going to try to appease people. It's like but I think at some point people are like, good, because I don't want that either. I think, when you're trying to get the latest clip on YouTube or Instagram, it's literally like every day you're trying to create a one-hit wonder. And it's like, I think when you stop chasing that, you're like, listen, like, I'm all about quality and integrity. Like, I will be here. I know my shit. Like, I'm going to help you. But it's like, I don't want to play that game. And it's like, the other thing is this, like, the basic stuff done well every day is how you build a foundation.
Mm-hmm.
You look at a city or money, it's like anyone that just does a good thing consistently, it adds up to success long term.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like more so with health than anything. That's so important. I think like we think that like at some point in life, I can sacrifice that world. And it's funny to me, like how many successful people that think that like, well, yeah, but like once I retire, I'll go get my health back. And you're like, dude, it don't work. They have this one assumption that their health is just going to be there when they get there. And you're like, how did you assume that? Because I wouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could have all the money in the world, but if your quality of life is poor, you're poor. To me, that's
Yeah.
what I say anyway. So, with mouth taping,
Mhm.
and there's a company that I used to use. It's called Somnifix. Now I just go with like 3M surgical tape at night. Just cheaper, easier, effective. Um, Not fancy. I do believe that also the basic, simple stuff is going to be the stuff that withstands the test of time. Just stick to the basic stuff, and you really can't go wrong if you do that consistently. But with mouth taping, say someone doesn't have the best jaw structure and they also have a lot of restriction in their nasal passage. Could mouth taping actually be detrimental to them? Is there a case where it would be a contraindication?
Yeah. I guess the PR answer starts with you should always consult your doctor.
I'll leave that.
Um, okay, we're good. We're good. Okay,
Yeah.
we cleared that one. Check the box. So I think it's like this. I think anything can work for anyone. I think there's the like, okay, like mouth taping is suggested in the literature for those that have mild apnea and nothing more. I think if someone's never really been sleep tested, how do they know what their apnea is? So outside of talking with a doctor and actually getting tested, I guess you can try it at your own risk. And I've heard a few good ENTs basically say to me that like, if you can basically keep your tongue on the roof of your mouth and breathe through your nose for 3 minutes, like you could try it. And then I would always tell people that like, if you could use like some X Clear, some saline, clean out your nose an hour before bed, tell people to put the tape on an hour or two before they go to sleep. Just see if you can even tolerate it watching TV. Because if you can't, then you're sure as hell probably not going to. And then it's like if you have the mild apnea and it helps, because I know a number of people that it works well for, but it's like the one thing that I think about is like this: if your tongue doesn't fit on the roof of your mouth because there's not enough space, technically you might be able to nasal breathe before you go to sleep with tape on. But it's like if your tongue doesn't have anywhere to go, especially when you get to deeper levels of sleep, is it making it worse? And I think it's like this, like you could try it for a few days. It's like if you had a partner to watch you or something, it's like you're gonna know whether you feel a difference or not. And then there's like I think for those that like can't get their tongue, or they wake up in the morning, they've got scallop tongue where they've got like ridges on their tongue, or they feel worse, like it's definite, probably like a hell no. But then there's those, like for someone like you, for instance, if you say you've been practicing, you've just had a low tongue, you didn't know, but like if your tongue actually fits and then you're doing some exercises and stuff to help strengthen it and you're using the tape, it might actually reinforce. So like my business partner, I think he's 5'6". He grew up, can breathe really well through his nose. During allergy season, he sometimes will bring his tongue down off the roof of his mouth. I think he gets a little congested. If he mouth tapes, his tongue fits normally. It fits pretty well in his palate. When he mouth tapes, it really helps ensure, even during allergy season, he sleeps better.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I've seen it go both ways. It's like more of a, trying it for a few days. I think a lot of times people, you'll know. I think outside of people getting used to the fact that it's like a new, and maybe they sleep and breathe all weird because they got something on their face. Like outside of that, it's like, you're going to know.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, it could, go ahead.
I found when I actually laid down, so I can nasal breathe all throughout the day, no problems at all. I could do my workouts and such, perfect. But when I lay down, for whatever reason, that's when my mouth wants to just drop open. That's the reason why I still mouth tape to this day, even though I've been doing it probably for over a year. I can get away with it sometimes, but I'd just rather not. And I was actually thinking about pillows with this. So if you're laying on a pillow and you're sleeping on your back, wouldn't that put you in a predisposed forward head posture where it's very difficult for you to actually nasal breathe?
Yeah. And I would say, like, for most people, like, they probably are best not sleeping on their back from an apnea perspective. I mean, more like just most humans are predisposed to forward head posture. And it's like from a pillow perspective, that or like sleeping on an incline is better. I think like 15, 20-degree incline, like whether a chair or bed, like it just changes the physics as far as in the oral cavity, I mean, the pressure going on with the tongue to give you like an advantage.
Okay, that makes sense.
But like one thing I would tell you is this: for someone that already knows, like I think one of the best things is there's a company, they're called mute nasal dilators. But basically it's like an expander you put in your nose, and it will basically like open your nasal valve. So I think that's the most important thing for most people. 70% of your resistance in your nose is going to sit in the first 3 centimeters. So often if someone's had a tongue basically that's supposed to sit on their palate, your nose is supposed to be like the tent. If the tongue hasn't been there, the tent's been collapsed. So oftentimes people, the nasal valve in the front of the nose often has been compromised and jaded due to like a deviated septum. So the integrity of the nasal valve isn't that good. And then when you can't keep your tongue there, you lose the support necessary to optimize the physics at the nose when you're sleeping. So what the mute nasal dilator does is like it'll basically keep the structural integrity of the opening of your nose, whether your tongue's there or not. And I mean, I have different testing equipment. Like I literally give it to my like Starbucks barista, like during allergy season. But like, I mean, they send them to me all the time. I give them a bunch of my athletes, but they're like 15, $20 on Amazon for a 3-pack. And it's like, I'm talking, if for myself before I had my nasal valve, is like I was 2x the air I could breathe in my nose with one in my nose. And that's it. I literally tell most people, if like, especially during allergy season, it's like Xlear is really good to basically just lubricate the nose, put kind of something where it's like a Vaseline or something inside of the nose, and then just the mute nasal dilator, or they do the exercise version as well. Some people actually like those better for sleep, but you can use both in the gym or during the day.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even for someone that lives alone, or they don't care, their partner doesn't care, it's like if you could get home and put something in your nose and all of a sudden get 2x more air for every breath and not tax the system as much, why would you not put that in your nose?
Mm-hmm. Would that over time make it easier for the tongue to sit to the roof of the mouth and then just provide more structure to the tent?
I feel like it's like this: you just like made the tent bigger, without having to do anything. It's just a crutch, but
Yeah.
it's like after you're done developing, your midline suture in your palate heals, and it's like, the bone fuses, and it's like you're never outside of the fact that your tongue can fit on your palate, like there's enough real estate for it to fit. It's just a strengthening problem. You could strengthen the tongue. When it doesn't fit, because it's like the mismatch is like you're basically trying to put a shoe that's a size and a half too small in your foot and get through your day, like it's not going to stay. And this is where, like, I've heard guys like Mike Muse say that like you probably need like 35 to 37 millimeters in your upper jaw from intermolar width if you're going to consistently have enough real estate for your tongue when you train it to stay up there. Otherwise, it's like there's not enough foothold, and it's like it's just going to come down.
So how can we increase this real estate the least invasive way? So say someone doesn't want to go with braces. Is there a way to do so?
Yeah. So I would say like so Vivos DNA. So that's where I started my expansion journey. I guess it's kind of one of those things where I like the Vivos DNA. They make different appliances for young kids. I think it's good. Some of them are good. And then I really like them for older people. So basically it's like a retainer that activates the stem cells on your palate and will force growth everywhere in your jaw. So it's like much slower growth than you're going to see with like a rapid palate expansion that like, just dramatically changes. So for instance, my upper jaw went, I think it was like 21 months. I went from 28 millimeters to 31. And I wore this thing 10 to 12 hours every single night for 2 years. So there was an upper and lower appliance. So my lower jaw went from 31 to 35, my upper 28 to 31. So that's a little bit. I think some people, I have a job where I have to talk all day long. So if someone's like at home and they have a job where they can just like, they don't have to talk, you can keep that thing in your freaking mouth all day long. And I've seen people in their 60s and 70s double their size of their airway in a matter of a year because they can wear it and it's covered by Medicare. I believe I read that. So, I mean, it's kind of one of those a no-brainer, a 70-year-old that doesn't want to get cut that literally is like, yeah, all I have to do is go in and get a retainer and wear it to bed and I can double. Like, you're like, why would everyone not wear this thing?
Now, if they expand their jaw, will that inherently increase the size of their nose?
Yeah, like, there you go. That's what I have. That's my first expander.
Okay.
So, I mean, you literally like these prongs basically like activate the stem cells on your palate to give you basically what you would have recognized in a traditional growths if your body had kind of gotten there.
Hmm.
So I think that's a really good situation. I think there's another one. So her IG is Rich Sleep, but there's a Dr. Joseph DeCruz out of Australia. So he created this appliance. It's called the Soma plate, which I think is awesome as well. So once again, it's another appliance that's like a retainer. This one has like a thick block underneath it. So basically, I don't know if it's like a 6 to 10 millimeter block. So your lower teeth are going to sit up against the block, and then this upper one sits on your teeth. And what this does is, from all the stuff he's talked about, is it provides enough space so that you're no longer clenching. Yeah. So basically, it's really hard to breathe and to go parasympathetic when you're always in this clenched, I can't breathe. So what it does is it forces you can't clench because your teeth are used to like this and you've just put 10 millimeters of space. So what happens over time is all the muscles in the face relax. Mm-hmm. And what that does is allow the teeth, basically the joints in the back, to eventually just get some freedom. And it basically, what it does is allow the TMJ joints to basically rebalance. And then over the 2 years, he talks about like the remodeling to where someone might have a 35 millimeter opening in their jaw, like a 2 finger, 2.5 finger. and he calls restoring 50 millimeter plus an opening where you're like 3 to 4 fingers can fit inside your two teeth. But it's because my mandible is no longer trapped. My lower jaw can come forward. That allows my head to go back over my shoulders. And it's more so I'm no longer clenching, which allows my cranium and the hole at the base of the skull, the occiput, and all my cranial nerves to just breathe properly. So Rich Sleep, Dr. Jasmine Elmore, she's out of North Carolina. So she is the one allowing, or basically the only one at this point offering use of that device in America. And then Dr. Cruz in Australia. And then outside of that, then you start to look at basically palate expansion. In a palate expansion, I would say, you got basically something like this, where this basically sat on my back teeth. And then basically what they did is they put braces on me. You go into surgery. So there's different procedures. Some of these, they basically have a more solid screw. You don't go in for surgery. So it depends on your male, female, how old you are. Oftentimes it's depending on how rigid the sutures are in your midline of your palate. A lot of times for girls, they have a softer palate. So you can basically crack the sutures with basically just turning the key, versus a lot of guys might have to have their palate split using a saw. So they'd go under, but that's what I had done. But what it does is it's like imagine a piece of paper, right? If you don't go in and you're splitting, it's like you're trying to tear a piece of paper perfectly, but you might not get it right when you're just turning a key. Whereas a surgeon goes in and they can cut it in half like a pair of scissors. And this is where you talk about like asymmetrical expansion or issues related to stuff when you're expanding the jaw, because you don't get a clean rip. You get this jagged rip, and now you've got, one side of your maxilla expands more than the other. The issue is that creates a crossbite, and now the orthodontist has to go in and figure out how to like bring the bite back and kind of get everything in line.
What's the recovery like for that? What you had done?
So I was expanded February 18th of last year, and basically you go in, you end up leaving surgery that day. They have you expanded like 2 millimeters. They'll expand it like 5 millimeters while you're under, and then they bring it back to like 2. So you're already coming out like 2 millimeters wider. And then over the course of the next 2 months, they just there was collaboration between my ortho and my facial surgeon to kind of decide kind of like, all right, what is optimal here? Because I think you could open someone 15. The only thing that matters at the end of the day, can the orthodontist bring the bite back together? So it's like at some point, my facial surgeon said, it's really smart. He's like, yeah, at some point, like your teeth have to work like teeth. He's like, I read this stuff all the time. You're like, yeah, I get expanded 15 millimeters. Like, yeah, what does that look like 30 years from now when your TM joints are like, no. You've had this small oral cavity, and now someone just basically expanded it by 50%. And then it's just like, what are the long-term effects on your joints and the muscles from having that much change?
Ouch. I'm in a little bit of pain just hearing this, my friend.
Yeah, but like, I think I expanded over like 2 months, and then I was done. And then it's like what they do is, think of like a cast on your arm, right? 6-8 weeks to heal. So since it's your jaw, the standard is 6 months. So a lot of times they'll leave the expander in to act as a cast to give support to the midline so that the sutures. So like for me, they cut at the zygomatic arch and then the midline. But it's just like, then for 6 months, you're just letting the bone heal. And then it's kind of one of those things where then they'll start to go to work with the like low level tension with the braces to basically bring the bite back together.
You're able to eat during this, correct? Or is it like
it's just, but it's like I had to go soft foods for probably, I think, and it's like for me, dude, I had like a nice diastema straight out of the NHL. Like, look, I was missing my front tooth. The
Sexy.
cool thing was like everyone like in my gym like knew. They're like, "That's awesome, man. Good for you."
I mean, it seemed to help. So,
Yeah, dude. I would tell, and it is the best thing I ever did in my life. Like game changer.
hmm.
It's like to think that someone could like, yeah, I'm gonna 2x your airway. You're like, yeah, that sounds good. That's money well spent.
What would you say has been the most significant improvement that you've seen then? Because not a lot of people that are going to listen to this would even consider that they have a nasal restriction problem or a problem breathing. So I can't imagine many people would go down the route that you've gone through. So I think it's very important that you've done the work that you've done because how else would anyone know?
It's like, I guess I would say this. It is the most significant thing is understanding the context of the measurements that changed as a result. It's like I've read so many medical journal articles and talked to so many people that like you just I just see it every day. I see people that are worth 30, 40, $50 million. They come in my gym and it's like they can't move because they can't breathe. They don't sleep well. And it's like these people have everything we've been programmed to want in life, and the last 20 years of their life sucks. Like why would you want to spend 20 years of your life on the back end just feeling like death? And I think for me, it's like I experienced feeling like death. There were many days in this that I thought about ending my life. Straight up. It was horrible. I had an awesome job. I have a great family. I have money in the bank. None of that matters. This taught me that most people that have their health have everything. They just don't know it. They're so focused on what they think they need that they can't see what they have. And health is everything because I was my whole life basically taught to want success and G wagons and the nice house and yeah. And then you realize that like you're thinking about ending your life and you would give it all back in a second to have your health. And it lets you know like what's really important in life. And you're like, maybe people don't get to the extreme with their fatigue or whatever that I felt, but it's like, what's the point living if you don't get to enjoy it and like be the best version of yourself? Like, why would you want to get up? And it's like to just like to just realize that like at the end of this train track, the last 20 years on the track like just suck. It's like it's just like people just fade away and their souls just they're just crushed. You just see people that they're like mojo is just gone.
Yeah.
And they're just getting up every day and their routine keeps them going. But it's like, I don't know. I want to be playing grab ass with my wife on the beach at 80 years old and be like, yeah, like it's like you don't got to be dead because you're 80. I think it's like, but if you don't sustain enough health when you get there, it's like it's horrible. And I feel like I mourn the loss of myself through all of this. Like it's like losing a little bit more of yourself every day due to fatigue and just like not being able to live life. And it's like this, it sucks. And it's like to come out on the other side just to go back to where I came from. It's like, no. It's like my goal with this is to help anyone not suffer like I did or find answers because I wouldn't wish it on anyone.
Now you feel like you're alive.
Yeah. And it's like, I want to go help people find answers. It's like, I just talk to moms all the day. It like breaks my heart. Like, you got narcissist husbands that are doctors or they think the mom's crazy. There's nothing wrong with my kid. Tongue ties are voodoo science.
Mhm.
You got this mom. It's like, yeah, my kid's ADHD. He wets his bed 3 days a week. And it's like, my husband doesn't think there's anything wrong, or you just got these parents that they just don't know where to turn. And you're like, dude, these kids, like you said, your son, he says he's never going to know what he didn't have. And it's like, dude, he just gets to benefit from you knowing what you know today. And it's like, that's the gift of life. It's like, if you don't take knowledge to basically allow the next generation to just be ahead of the curve in ways that you weren't, like, what's the point?
That's exactly what I want to show him and give him as much as possible. So he will see it. He may not experience himself, but the same way that you experience it with some of the people that you work with that would give up anything for their health, he's going to be able to see it. So, and that's what I want to give to him through learning about these type of things. That way we can hopefully prevent it in the future. Because the way that I see things going now, if people don't make a pivot really quick and jump on the right train, then it's only going to get worse. Because I see it every day. I see kids with very, very tiny jaws right now. And people may not consider this like a huge issue, but the tail end of someone's life, like 20 years old, how you say that it's almost like they've lost their soul. It's like they lost their mojo. I fully agree with you. And one of the first books that I read regarding breathing was Normal Breathing by Artur Rahimov. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but
No.
he mentions in there how people that are closer to death, they're breathing the most, like their ventilation rate is the highest. And you mentioned COVID, PRI earlier. I had him on an interview and he mentioned that people could have avoided all of this had they just been breathing less. But if we don't have the real estate, as you're mentioning, and we can't support the tent, if we can't actually breathe through our nose properly, you're going to be predisposed to all these ailments, all these issues. So if we're not addressing airway, and I see it in your work, you're so passionate about it. I love it, man. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your story.
Yeah, for
It's
sure.
very important. So if we're not addressing proper breathing, we're screwed.
Yeah, because it's only going to get worse. It's not like food quality is getting better. And it's like you got nutrient quality going away. You got more and more processed things. You got people trying to be less human every day. And it's like, it doesn't end well.
Try to bring them back.
Yeah, one at a time, one airway at a time, baby.
Mhm. So last question here. I believe that you have a video up on your Instagram demonstrating how you actually do this, but how would people measure their own intermolar health width?
Yeah, so a few easy ways that people have retainers. Basically, what they could do is basically just take the retainer and like basically you're going to measure from basically what I would call like this is like the back of the teeth, like first set of molars. You would just measure from the inside edge of first molar to the other just to get an idea. If someone's been to a dentist or orthodontist that's done a 3D CT scan, they could get the measurement. But the easiest way is like you could take like a wax plate. It's or something that you can basically put, and you're just basically going to bite down. I've found these wax plates; they're awesome on Amazon. If anyone wants it, literally DM me, and I'll send you two in the mail, and you can try this at home. And I have a whole protocol. I'm actually going to do. I want to do this for adults, just an internal study where it's like I get 100 people, and I'm just going to mail them all like two wax plates, and it's got information on how to measure it. But like, someone can just measure after they do the wax plate, and then basically you just kind of etch the wax plate on like a piece of paper to kind of trace it out. You can measure it. But then that just gives people a rough idea. And like the McNamara that I was talking about, he basically talks about like for adequate form and function of the oral cavity and respiration, he talks about 40 millimeters plus. And I mean, I've seen stuff out there that like they'll talk about women being at 35, guys at 40. But here's the thing, 1,000 years ago, any continent, you take an adult male, female, it doesn't matter where they were all 50 millimeters plus. So I don't know if I would say that a girl, being slightly smaller I don't know. But I think it's like an all or nothing type thing. I think there's Dr. Marisa Santos out of Buenos Aires. I think she's one of the Michael Jordans in this world, but she has an entire program where she expands 2 and 3 to 6 year olds. And I think she's going to change the game in the next 5 years because she's working on a study now with a bunch of data where like she expands all these 2, 3, 4 year olds. She'll expand them for 6 months, 90 days of myofunctional therapy. And then she waits an entire year to test them to see if they're nasal breathing or mouth breathing. If they're nasal breathing, they're good to go. If they're mouth breathing, she does it again. Same thing, repeats, expands them a second time, 90 days of myofunctional. And then basically, but like, she just talks about like, she will have data on 3 to 5 year olds that are going to blow the rest of the world out of the water. Real time data. Like she's going to compare her group and be like, it's literally like putting USA basketball on the court with Mexico. It's like, yeah, but it's going to be like that. And it's like, then it's just going to be a matter of how do we bring this into the world of helping children? Because if it falls into dental, which that's the case for most of this stuff, and medical isn't going to pick up the bill, regardless of what the science says, I don't know how we give this to every child in the world, but it is my belief in 10 to 20 years, we will expand every kid at 2 or 3 years old, or we'll figure out something. And I'll bet you we figure out how to keep it to where most kids, their wisdom teeth fit by the time they're adults. And I'll be curious if you start expanding most kids at 2 and 3 years old, how many kids need braces because they just naturally have enough space and if their wisdom teeth fit. But like if you just did that and you got rid of orthodontics, if you got rid of the need for allergy medicine and asthma because everyone can breathe, I mean, you just wiped away most of the medical world. But like this is a world of prevention that we should be shooting for instead of world of making money and treating symptoms.
Where things don't actually get better. If anything, you're just
Yeah.
you get sucked in the whirlpool, and it's very hard to get out. Awesome, Greg. Well, I am so appreciative of your time, brother. And
Yeah, man, that was awesome.
where would people be able to find you? I know you have Project Airway. Do you have anything else going on?
Yeah, so my other IG for our gym. So our gym is Premier Fitness Systems. You can check us out, YouTube, our website, and then my other IG is PFS Golf. But I would say I've got a YouTube for Project Airway as well. But feel free, you could shoot me DM on there if you're looking for one of those wax bite plates. I've got the basically the concept pinned on the top of my profile so you can kind of see what that looks like. But real simple process. I'll mail you a bite plate and probably in a matter of a minute, you kind of know where you stand. And then feel free, you can always shoot me an email, you reach out through IG or whatever. But yeah.
Awesome, brother. I'll include all of that in the show notes. And I actually want to jump on that wax plate if I could.
All right, bro. Hit me up. You're number one in my study. Yeah,
I
I would do
love that.
120 to 50 year olds. I've got like 10 questions, and it's like I just want to get data and just kind of see generically like how many people are breastfed, intermolar width, have people been sleep tested, but it's just kind of understanding more, and I think being able to speak to it.
Awesome. I agree.
Cool, man.
Love what you're doing, man.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, dude.